What's going on, everybody? It's your boy Duo, and today I have something incredibly special for you guys. This right here is my undefeated ELDLICH Dogmatika deck list. I went undefeated with this deck at not one, but two tournaments back to back. I actually just got back from the second tournament. It was a back-to-duel event, so I was able to bring home this sick playmat and field center. Always love to get the goodies for doing well in tournament. So I figured, getting undefeated once is always pretty cool, but after being able to go undefeated 2 times, I thought it was time to share this deck with the world and you guys. So, without further ado, let's get right into it. So starting off with the monsters of the main deck, we have 2 copies of ELDLICH the Golden Lord. I know a lot of lists like to play this card at 3, however this is not the primary focus of the deck. We are mostly focusing on using the Dogmatika cards to gain card advantage. The ELDLICH just kind of complements that engine, so I think it's best to play this card at 2. Moving on to Ecclesia, I decided to play this card at 2. I considered playing it at 3, but I feel like with the abundance of Extravagance and Nadir Servant and just the ability to gain more cards, I felt that this card would be a little bit redundant at 3 and I would end up getting multiple copies, and you don't really want that. I honestly liked it at 2 and I don't think I would change it. And then obviously your 1 copy of Fleur de Lis. You gotta play this if you're gonna be playing Dogmatika. It is such a good card, so good for being able to pressure your opponent and negate powerful cards, like Dragoon of Red Eyes or Appaloosa. It's just definitely an important card to have. Now moving on to our hand traps. This is a very hand trap heavy deck. I remember when I was first testing this deck, I tried the Traplich variant and I lost all 4 die rolls the first tournament I played that deck. I cried myself to sleep that night, and so I knew that I needed to play hand traps so I would be able to lose die rolls and be fine. Starting off with 1 copy of Nibiru, I was very torn on this card. I personally do not think it's worth it to play this card at 3. You can maybe see this card being played at 2. I didn't have the second copy, I didn't get it in time, and I couldn't find one before the tournament started, so I figured I'd just run it at 1, no big deal, and it didn't really come up. Moving on to our Gamma package, 3 copies of Gamma, 1 copy of Driver. This card is clutch. This carries so hard, just being able to, set a couple back row and be perfectly fine. Solemn Strike on legs, I really don't need to explain this much more. 2 copies of Ash Blossom and 2 copies of Ghost Ogre. I wasn't really a fan. I really don't like playing 3 of these hard once per turn hand traps, so I really felt like 2 Ash was the right play, and I think it did pay off. I was drawing Ash. And then Ghost Ogre. This was definitely a sleeper card for my pick. This is definitely more of a comfort pick for me. My big worry for this tournament was that I knew that there were going to be some very good Ad Ignister and Fluanderies players. With Fluanderies, you really do not want them to get their field spell off. Same thing, obviously, with Ad Ignister and Ignister Island. It's just a broken card. And on top of that, just being able to destroy monsters and force their opponent to kind of scramble to get resources together. This card, I definitely would say it worked. Moving on to our spell cards, we have a very simple spell core. We have our 3 copies of Pot of Extravagance, 3 copies of Nadir Servant, and 1 copy of Foolish Burial Goods. I don't really need to explain Nadir, everyone knows what this card does, it's broken. Pot of Extravagance, I felt like draw power was the right thing for this deck. I know some people are iffy about Pot of Extravagance and, Dogmatika kind of together, because you are banishing the cards that you want to send with the Dogmatika stuff. Because this deck really doesn't use the extra at all, you can just max out on your, Nadir targets and your punishment targets, and it's really not that big of a deal. I actually got to the point where I had to activate Extravagance, banishing 3 cards from my extra deck to draw 1, because I only had 4 cards left. It was an incredible 25-minute game. But I think that getting draw 2 off this card is just too overpowered to not play this thing. The 1 copy of Foolish Burial Goods, this was just kind of to add one more consistency card to the ELDLICH engine. I felt that it was, not getting started fast enough. And so with this, you're able to, search whatever Eldritch card you want. This basically is just set one, Eldritch or Golden Land Speller Trap from your deck, basically. And I didn't want to see 2 copies of it, so I just decided, I have a flex spot and I'll play it at 1. Moving on to the trap cards. Gozen Match, 3 copies. Whew, this card is broken. It is very matchup specific. There are some decks that can kind of play around it, like Drytron, and maybe like the occasional Dragon Link if they open the correct options, and like Phantom Knight. In the small ways that this card does limit those matchups, I think it is useful enough, and in some matchups this is just an instant win. All of these cards are light that you would summon Nibiru, your Dogmatikas, Eldlich, all that stuff is light. There's not really a way to screw yourself over. And in some matchups like Altergeist or, something else where all their monsters are different attributes, this kind of just becomes a free win. Moving on to Dogmatika Punishment. This is your primary advantage gainer. This is your go-to trap card. This is your bread and butter. I was resolving this card so many times. It is such a good trap card. Infinite Impermanence. Hand trap. It's obviously good if you set it no matter what. This card basically has no weaknesses, so we play it at 3. Solemn Strike. This card, definitely I was sleeping on this card a little bit, I won't lie, but after playing it I can see the use of it, because not only is it incredibly good going first, but it's also a very good card going second. You can set this card up with Gozen Match, and you can actually break a lot of boards just by going activate Gozen Match, and then your opponent attempts to negate it, and then you Solemn Strike that monster. Because it is a counter trap, they don't really have any way to respond to it with any of their other, Moral Savage, they can't respond. So this is just such a good safety card to play. Then we have our Eldlich package. So 3 copies of Scarlet Sanguine, 3 copies of Conquistador, and 1 copy of Wakero. I think Wakero is an incredibly useless card. It's so niche in its, application that I almost considered not playing it at all, and honestly I'm still considering cutting it, but I do like having it at 1. I think you should focus more on hand traps and Dogmatika cards, because that is what's gonna help you win the resource grind, not banishing a card from the graveyard. This does have some pressure. 1800 is a decent beater for a trap monster that also searches stuff. So I'm torn on this card, but I think it did have some use at 1. I'm gonna move myself up a little bit so you guys can see the extra deck and the side deck. So, starting off with the side deck, we are playing 3 copies of Lava Golem. This was the Spice. This card was Lancia, and I could not be happier that I took it out for Lava Golem. My big worry and the big weakness of this deck is that it does have a little bit of trouble outing Dragoon and those big beefy boss monsters, like Megaclops and stuff like that. So being able to break boards with this unblockable, not able to be responded to card just helped me out a ton. This could be Sphere mode, but I personally like only being able to tribute 2 monsters because it allows me to leave an extra deck monster on the field. That way I can use Ecclesia and I can special summon her from hand with her effect, and I can still, continue my plays and be able to set up a stronger board in response. Then 3 copies of Inspector Border. Oh my gosh, this card carried me so hard in games 2 and 3, it's not even funny. Dropping this card on some of my matchups, I'm thinking about stuff like, Adamancipator, Altergeist, Fluwanderies was there at this tournament. This card, just you drop it on them and then you are able to do so much. Because of the Eldlich cards, you are, not really limited in your pressure. You can still put big bodies on the field and not really have to worry too much. So this card is not that big of an inconvenience. This card is so broken. I didn't feel confident enough to put it in the main. I only wanted it really if I knew I was going first. This is also a great way to play around cards like Lightning Storm and Harpy's Feather Duster, which were a big worry of mine. A lot of people side those along with stuff like Evenly Matched. So being able to have, you know, a diverse set of disruption or stun, whatever you want to call it, I think was really important, and this card is the solution. 3 copies of Super Polymerization, absolutely. With Dragoon and Destroy Phoenix Enforcer running rampant right now, you absolutely need to be siding this, or potentially even main decking it if you're feeling a little ballsy. You need to be able to, you know, break through boards and have a chance when you're siding to go second, and this card, you know, it's just universally has always done the trick. 1 copy of Harpy's Feather Duster and 1 copy of Lightning Storm. Obviously everyone's playing Feather Duster. This is great in the Ditto or any back row deck in general. And then I had 1 flex spot in the side that I needed something to do, and I figured, you know, I'll just play a second copy of Harpy's Feather Duster, essentially. And then 3 copies of Solemn Judgment and 1 copy of Imperial Order. People say that you should be main decking these. I tested it. I hated it. I thought this was awful. I think that these cards are terrible. This card is terrible if you don't have the right matchup, and this card is terrible if you lose the die roll. You really need to focus on winning game 1 with this deck. It's so important. So I felt that this was really good in the side, just as an, you know, more anti-Feather Duster and Lightning Storm and Twin Twisters and Evenly Matched. This just helps keep your board a little bit safer, as well as also providing incredibly, you know, good defense if they don't open those cards. Alright, moving on to the extra deck, we are going to have, I think this is going to be pretty simple, but I do have a couple of spicy techs in here that I think you guys are going to enjoy. Starting off with some pretty basic stuff, 3 copies of Elder Entity Intis and 1 copy of Fossil Warrior Skull Knight. If I could play 4 copies of Intis, I would, but I can't because of game mechanics, so the Fossil Warrior Skull Knight will act as the 4th copy, although that never really came up. Normally, I was never banishing 3 copies of Intis off of Extravagance. It was normally 2, and I really only needed 1 to generate enough advantage to win games. So this is pretty standard. And 3 copies of Titaniclad the Ash Dragon and 1 copy of Tri-Brigade Farragut the Barren Blossom. Is this a Tri-Brigade deck? Maybe, but let me explain. So this card says that if this card is sent to the graveyard, you can draw 1 card and then place 1 card from your hand on the bottom of the deck. So the way I thought about it was this was essentially the 4th copy of Titaniclad, or it's also the alternative if I already have sufficient Dogmatika cards in my hand. This actually did come in use, and I was purposefully sending this off of Nadir Servant instead of Titaniclad because I opened Dogmatika cards like crazy, but then on top of that, it's also really good for fixing your hand. You know, if you're opening cards like Cyframe Driver, opening Eldlich going first is really inconvenient for you, as well as, you know, all of your Eldlich Golden Land cards are hard once per turn, same thing with Extravagance. You're playing a lot of, you know, ways to sort of not necessarily brick, but choke on drawing 2 copies of a hard once per turn. And so I think that Farragut allows you to kind of get an opportunity to refresh your hand and, you know, fix those bad little inconveniences. Obviously, Titaniclad is really, really good. Alright, moving on to our final Dogmatika punishment target. We have, this is real, we are playing 5-headed dragon. We are making big brain plays. 5-head dragon. Remember, have you read this card? It can't be destroyed by battle with a dark, earth, water, fire, or wind monster, and it has 5,000 attack. This thing is broken. Nah, I'm just kidding. The whole point of playing this is so that you can have the highest possible attack, so you can always activate Dogmatika punishment. These situations are pretty rare and none of it did come up, but I would rather be prepared than not. The situations that this can come up in, number 1, Megaclops is a big boy. And then number 2 is in the kind of weird scenarios where you need to get rid of a Dragoon, but it has already gained attack. Because once it gets up to 4K, so say you bait it with, you know, like a Pot of Extravagance or something like that, it is now up to 4K attack. So even if you do get Ecclesia on the field and then you search your Fleur, and then Fleur summons itself and negates the Dragoon, you still don't have a way to out it because the attack gain is permanent and it stays regardless of whether or not its effects are negated at the time or not. So you still need to have big monsters in your extra deck that are going to be able to out this thing once its effects are negated. And 5-head dragon just so happens to be a big chunky boy. Moving on to our super poly targets, we are going to be playing 1 Starving Venom Fusion Dragon, 1 Predaplant Dragostapelia, 1 World Chalice Guard Dragon Almar Duke, and 1 Mud Dragon of the Swamp. I figured just try to cover as much as possible. Obviously with Destroyer, Phoenix, Enforcer, and Dragoon running rampant right now, these 2 are going to be the most common targets. If you can get Dragostapelia out, I think it's worth it. I was initially playing like 3 copies of Starving Venom and 3 copies of the Dragostapelia because I was worried about Extravagance, but then I kind of thought about it. If you have Super Poly in your hand, you can activate that during standby phase, and then you can get that target out of your deck, and then when your main phase starts, you activate Extravagance because that's how that card works. So I feel like it's better to just play a diverse amount of super poly targets and just cover everything. And then onto our 1 copies of Constellar Pleiades and 1 copy of Divine Arsenal AA Zeus Sky Thunder. I used to play 3 copies of Wakero and I was making this way more often, but after I moved Wakero to 1, I have not even touched these cards. I'm relying more on the Dogmatika cards, and honestly, these 2 didn't really do anything for me. So that concludes the deck list. Thank you guys so much for watching until the end. I hope you guys enjoyed this deck list. Feel free to drop a like. If you guys have any questions about the deck list, feel free to drop them in the comments section below, and I'll do my best to answer those. But yeah, I hope you guys have a good day, and I'll see y'all later. Peace.
I reminisce of a time gone. I never thought I would be in a war zone. Big salute, rest in peace to my man Tone. We got a club on. In other words, in the early morning, we used to get chicks to the suite.
Advantage through Dogmatika cards. This is just kind of a buffer. What the shit?